Hi guys, Olive here. Here today to admit that I waited far too long to read some popular nonfiction books. I've spoken about this in the past, but I can get a little weird about things that are really popular. It's like when everyone is doing something, everyone is talking about something, my inner rebellious teenager comes out and I want absolutely nothing to do with it. And this applies to the book world as well. If I don't read a book before it gets really popular, before everyone is reading it, everyone is talking about it, then I will read anything but that book. It's an impulse that I know that I have. I'm trying to work against it because I don't like it. It's not productive. It keeps me from joining in on conversations as they're happening. And most importantly, it keeps me from reading these really good books sooner. So, in today's video, I want to tell you about 10 great nonfiction books that, for one reason or another, I put off reading for far too long. I want to do this video in the hopes that giving myself a good roasting will keep me from doing this going forward, but I also wanted to encourage you, if you want to read any of the books on this list and you haven't gotten to them yet, please learn from my mistakes and consider picking these up sooner rather than later. I'll start off by giving myself a little bit of grace before I fully go into roasting myself, because I had a somewhat legitimate reason to put off reading Cleopatra by Stacy Schiff. I bought this book when I was in college. I was home from college, I think either on Thanksgiving break or on holiday recess, and I wanted to go to our local Borders. This was back when Borders was still in business. I wanted to get my own copy of this book because I wanted to read it so badly. Let's just say that I kept myself very busy in college. I took as many classes as they would allow me. One time I took 1 credit over the credit limit, so I owed more tuition that semester. And I studied really hard. It was my entire focus for those 4 years. So as much as I wanted to be reading for pleasure, it just wasn't realistic for my schedule or my energy level. So I actually didn't get to this one until I was a few years out of college. I think I actually picked this one up just a few months before I started this channel. Even though I know I had a decent reason for putting this one off as long as I did, I am sad I didn't get to it sooner because it's just as good as I thought it was going to be. It is a fantastic biography of Egypt's most famous female ruler. It gives a lot of insight into who she was as a person, even though it's very challenging to know for certain. Stacy Schiff has to make a lot of educated guesses based on the sources, but then she also has to point out why some of those sources are more credible than others, because some of them were written by Cleopatra's enemies, and they were trying to push a specific narrative about her. This one is totally worth a read. I actually wouldn't mind giving it a reread here in the near future. All the rest of the books on this list, I have less of an excuse for not picking up sooner. Like, honestly, I have no idea why I waited so long to read Kitchen Confidential by Anthony Bourdain. I actually read this book for the first time right after he died. I was already planning to read this book. It was already on that month's TBR before it even happened. So it was very sad timing. Kitchen Confidential is Anthony Bourdain's memoir of finding the food world, but it is also an unflinchingly honest portrait of what it's like working in a kitchen and what it's like running a restaurant. He is extremely candid about what those things are like. He has so much passion, but he also could be ruthless and he could be full of himself, very typical of a chef. I have always been very interested in the food world, so immediately after I finished this one, I couldn't believe that I had waited so long to read it. It felt like it belonged in my hands. I still think about his thoughts about garlic every single time I'm in my kitchen. I know I definitely have no excuse for waiting to read In Order to Live by Yeonmi Park for as long as I did. This is another memoir. It's about the author's early life in and eventual escape from North Korea. It is a gripping and heartbreaking story, and pretty much everyone was reading this during the very first Nonfiction November we had here on Booktube, all the way back in 2015, because this book had been released not long before that. But did I read it that year? Or even the next year? Of course I didn't. I waited until 2021 to pick up this book, and when I did, I could immediately see what everyone saw in her incredible story. I guess the only silver lining of me waiting so long to pick this book up is that since I just read it last year, it is still fairly fresh in my brain, and that may serve me well because her next book comes out in early 2023. But another nonfiction book that I remember a lot of people talking about on BookTube at that time was Brain on Fire by Susanna Cahalan. This is the author's story of developing a very rare, a very difficult to diagnose autoimmune disease in her mid-20s, and the symptoms of that disease very closely mimicked losing her mind. Gripping is a word that I would also use to describe this book. Terrifying is another. I was so fascinated by so many parts of this book, especially right toward the end when she's discussing perception versus reality. It's really hard for her now that she's well to reconcile what she felt was true during this time in her life with what she knows is true now. She was having a lot of hallucinations and they felt so real to her. So it's really hard to wrap her brain around the fact that those things didn't actually happen. This was great. I'm really mad at myself that I put off reading this for so long, but now that I have, I'm definitely intrigued by her newest book called The Great Pretender. If anyone's read that, please let me know if you think it's worth reading. If it is, I promise I will get to it sooner rather than later. My friend Jill from the Booktube channel, The Book Bully, spent a really long time, longer than she should have had to, trying to convince me to read Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keefe. This is her favorite nonfiction book, so she really wanted me to read it. It's the story of a missing mother in Ireland and what her disappearance may have had to do with the IRA during the Troubles. I had really high hopes for this one because Jill loves it so intensely, and our book tastes normally line up rather nicely, and I loved Empire of Pain. It was one of my favorite nonfiction books of last year. Yes, I read Empire of Pain before I read Say Nothing. I know, I don't make any sense. But I will admit, Say Nothing took a little while to win me over. I wasn't even convinced I liked it until really the final third of the book when everything came together. I could see what he was doing through the entire book, and I could see why it gets the praise that it does. So I'm going to take this as a lesson learned. If Jill is trying to convince me to read something, I'm going to pick it up and in a hurry. I also had people reaching out to me personally, like viewers of this channel, getting in contact with me, trying to convince me to read Know My Name by Chanel Miller. And still I put off reading it. I don't know why I do this. This is the author's story of going through a highly publicized court case stemming from her assault on a college campus. What she had to go through was unimaginable. Not just the initial attack, but then everything she had to deal with from the media, from the public, and then of course this trial. As you're reading through this memoir, it's hard to know what to be the most impressed by, because there's her gorgeous writing that just heartbreakingly encapsulates this entire experience. But then there's also the immense strength that she displayed during the entire ordeal. This is an extraordinary book. I wish I had read it sooner, but I have no one to blame for that but myself. I do think I know why I waited so long to read The Radium Girls by Kate Moore, though. I had read this story, the story of women who worked as dial painters, who painted a luminous radioactive paint onto watch faces and then later on faced health consequences because of their regular exposure to that paint. I had read that story in 2 previous books, abbreviated versions of that story, so I guess I thought I knew the story well enough that I didn't need to read an entire book about it. As it turned out, that was definitely not true, because I knew pieces of this story from reading those 2 previous books, but there was so much I didn't know, including the inspiring stories of how these women fought those companies trying to get their healthcare costs covered and trying to prevent these companies from being able to do this to women in the future, trying to prevent women in the future from suffering the same fate as them. As I learned, this is worth reading even if you know the story. And I think I also had a similar thought about Catch and Kill by Ronan Farrow, which is the journalist's account of investigating the many allegations made against movie producer Harvey Weinstein and all the different tactics that were used to try to kill Ronan Farrow's story. I thought I knew this story already because I had read She Said, written by the journalist who broke the story at the New York Times. But Farrow provides a whole new perspective. His is a fascinating, scary, and downright infuriating story about abuses of power and how cover-ups can be built into the fabric of institutions. The extent of the corruption is jaw-dropping. And while I found the book She Said was a lot more about the stories of the women who were coming forward, and I think that book is very important because it does that, I found that this book was a lot more about how those women were kept quiet, the mechanisms by which they were kept quiet for such a long time. If I could go back and do it all over again, I would read this book immediately after reading She Said because I think they would work really well as a pair. I have no idea why I took my sweet time getting to this next one. In fact, my own mother was on my case to finally read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. I feel like this is one of those rare nonfiction books that even people who normally dislike nonfiction feel compelled to pick up because just everyone is talking about it. Of course, I didn't pick it up when everyone was talking about it. I didn't pick it up until well after a decade after its publication, and I'm here to admit, it was a mistake. This is the multifaceted story of what are known as HeLa cells, cells that have been used for medical research for decades, but they originally belonged to a woman named Henrietta Lacks. In this book, we learn about her, we learn about her cells, we learn about her family, we get to see the bond that formed between the author and Henrietta's daughter during the process of researching this book. It's a very complex topic, but the author makes it so human and so understandable. After I finally read it, I got why it spoke to so many people. And then finally, the last book on this list is the one that I'm probably the maddest I put off reading for so long. It's Tiny Beautiful Things by Cheryl Strayed. I remember hearing about this book on the Book Riot podcast nearly a decade ago. I was just getting back into reading after college, and I remember them speaking about this book. I remember Rebecca raving about it, and it sounded really good. I just wasn't really in a rush to read it. But then on a whim earlier this year, it was during the spring, I just felt this desire for some wisdom. So I finally decided to pick up this book, and I was absolutely blown away. This is a collection of advice columns written by Cheryl Strayed, playing the character of Sugar. All the stories that she tells are her own. All the advice she gives is genuine. It's not as though she's putting on a mask, but she just takes on the name Sugar to give out advice. And as she's replying to these people writing into her, asking for advice because they're in a tough spot in their life, she responds with such kindness and such insight. I just absolutely loved it. I know I'm going to return to it again and again and again. It's going to be one of my favorites of the year, if not of all time. And to think, I could have read this one years ago and had all of these feelings back then. I'm really hoping that by assembling this list, shaming myself in this way, and that by having that realization that Tiny Beautiful Things gave me, that a new favorite book could be lingering amongst all those books that I'm putting off for no good reason, that hopefully I can just stop doing this. But I would love to hear from you. Do you find yourself putting off books? Do you have a reason for doing that, do you think? Are they similar to my reasons? Do you have your own reasons? I would love to hear all about it in the comment section below. All the books that I discussed in today's video will be linked for you in the description box below for your clicking convenience. If you're on a mobile device, just tap the title of this video and that will expand for you. And at the bottom of that exact same description box, you'll see links to everywhere you can find me around the internet, like Goodreads and Instagram, the two places where I'm the most active, in case you would like to keep up with what I am reading and writing about right now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.